Hello everybody. This is going to be a quick video about making silicone inserts for your Loony claw. There's a couple of reasons you might want to do this. First, we've had some issues with getting other grippy materials to stick to the 3D printed parts, and silicone is also going to be a lot grippier than many of the other options out there. The first step to this process is going to be preparing the molds. So as you can see, I have two claws here printed out. One is the servo side claw, which has the 4 holes in it, and one is the idler claw, which only has the bearing hole. Both of these are printed in PLA. The material doesn't really matter as long as it's quite rigid. I'll put a list of materials that we recommend up on the screen. Anything that's 3D printable is pretty good to use as long as it's not flexible. So don't use TPU, don't use nylon, things like that that are going to just bend instead of grip. So once you have your part printed out, you'll notice that there is this little extra ribbed piece printed onto the outside of the claw. This is actually the mold for the silicone. So your printer should have printed this with just 1 or 2 lines, and we want that to be pretty thin so that we can break it off once the silicone is cured. So the first step is going to be prepping your parts. These are not exactly the way they came off of my printer. So I printed these on an Ender 3 on a glass bed, and I used a brim to keep them held down to the bed. What you can see here is that the printer, or rather the slicer, decided to add a brim inside of the bottom of the mold. That shouldn't really be that big of a deal, but it'll create a kind of rough surface on the bottom of your silicone part. So I would recommend cutting off the brim if your slicer does decide to do that, so that it looks like this. You can see each of those triangular dogs is fully exposed all the way to the bottom, and that's going to be really important for the final step of this process. So if your claw comes out looking like this, you will need to cut off those parts. So let me do that. Alrighty, so I got the dogs cleaned up on the second claw. Nothing fancy, they're just free of a brim now. The next step is you're going to want to make sure there's no debris inside of the mold. You can see right there, there's a little piece of plastic that's just hanging out. Anything like that, or any dirt or grease or little bits of stuff that have gotten in your mold will come out in the final part. So we don't want the quality of our mold to be impacted by that. So make sure that they're clean. If they're coming straight off the printer, they should be pretty clean, but if you have any stringing like this, you want to go through and carefully remove all of that. So with as much of the stringing removed as possible, the next step is going to be sealing this bottom surface. Any kind of stiff tape works for this. I like aluminum or copper tape, though duct tape would work as well. You just want to seal off this big hole in the bottom to prevent the silicone from running out. The rigid tape is nice because it doesn't have a whole lot of wrinkles. You can see there that the entire surface is covered with a smooth bottom, and then you can kind of ignore this excess. You could cut it off, but it really doesn't matter that much. We're just trying to prevent the silicone from pouring out of the bottom. So we'll do that with both of them. An additional piece of tape that you'll want to add is around the outside edge of this mold. Sometimes, because the mold itself is only 1 layer line wide, there can be some little tiny holes in it. There can also be some big holes in it. One of these claws has a pretty good size, good size crack there. So we're going to just take a little bit of extra tape and seal that up, and then we'll be ready to pour our silicone. Now that we have our molds prepped, let's talk about the silicone. So silicone I'm using is an Alumilite 2-part platinum cure silicone. This will be very soft and quite tacky when it's done. This will not leave a residue on the cones, which is really important. It's also going to only stick to itself as it cures, so the adhesive on the back of the tape and the 3D printed mold itself should be fine for releasing from. So this is a 2-part by volume silicone, so we're going to use 2 marked plastic cups to measure out the amount of silicone we need. Each of these molds will only hold about 6.5 milliliters of silicone, but I'm going to measure out 10 milliliters of each part A and part B, because it's always better to have a little bit of extra than a little bit too little. If we have too little, we'll have to do 2 pours and they won't stick to each other very well. Now I've got both my part A and my part B measured out. It is really critical that these amounts are exactly the same. I was targeting 10 milliliters, but with some drip, the first one ended up being 12.5 milliliters. So now the second one also needs to be 12.5. The same thing goes for any other set of numbers. They have to match, otherwise the silicone won't set up properly. Now I'm going to mix them together. You can just pour one into the other container or vice versa. It is really important that you mix these materials very carefully. The final product must be mixed consistently. There should not be any bits of white or red left, just pink. There's a couple ways to do this. I'm just going to use a piece of a skewer because I can scrape down the walls and get into the little crevices and corners in the bottom. Just make sure that they are fully mixed before pouring them. This particular material has a working time of about 8 minutes, so you will need to have it mixed and ready to go into the mold in less than that amount of time. Here's the mixed material. You can see that it has no swirls, it's a uniform color. If you're going to be mixing this much, I would recommend using a larger container, but this is fine. So now we're going to carefully pour this into our molds. Hey guys, this is Future Jameson. Watching this back, I realized that the amount of overpour here is kind of ridiculous. The pour would be a lot cleaner if you had some kind of a syringe, even just an eyedropper, to inject the mold with silicone instead of pouring like this. Just make sure that it's washed and dried before you use it, so there's no risk of dirt or dust or oil being inside of the eyedropper. Other than that, it should be fine. Once this cures, I can peel it right off. We can use the long side just to get in there, and we want to make sure that we evenly fill the entirety of each mold. Once you've got your molds filled, gently tap them on the table to try to get any of the air to come out. Any air bubbles will make the silicone have inconsistent gripping properties, which is not ideal. It's okay if you have some small air bubbles, and they're kind of unavoidable, but you want to do your best to remove all the air. As you can see, there was quite a bit of overpour here, but that's all right. It'll cure and then be easy to remove once it's solid. So now we're ready for the curing process. This particular set of silicone takes about 30 minutes, so I'm going to give it about 45 just to be safe. Then we'll come back and demold these parts, do a little bit of cleanup, and we'll be ready to use them. Alrighty, so now we've got 2 claws that have some cured silicone in them. You can carefully touch and move around your part to see if the silicone is cured. This is after 45 minutes of curing, so it should be pretty solid by now. This one is a little bit stuck, but as you can see, it releases pretty easily. And even this stuff on the table, if you kind of rub your finger over it, it comes right off. Just make sure you don't get it in your clothes. So the next step is going to be taking off this excess. We can just pull it away here. And anything outside the mold should just come off like that. You can throw that away. We can do the same thing for the top of the mold. And you want to pull away from the part. So see, I'm not pulling straight up because if this piece is still connected to what's in here, we could risk pulling it all out. You want to just pull away to the side like this. And it should all come off like that. And now you can see that our mold actually came out pretty nice. I'm going to do that for this other part as well. Alrighty, now that we have most of that off, we can carefully remove the tape from the bottom. And the silicone, well, depending on what kind of tape you use, silicone may or may not stick to the tape. It shouldn't, but it might. You can kind of just roll it away like that, and it should come right off. And now we have a very flat, smooth surface for the bottom of our mold. The next step is going to be cutting off the excess plastic. This extra layer around the outside here is designed to be cut off. All you have to do is find the edge of it and take an X-Acto knife or something sharp and cut along that. Do this very carefully, as cutting through 3D printed plastic can kind of be a risky ordeal. Always cut away from yourself and make sure that there's no one else around you when you're doing it. Once you get one side off, you can kind of pry the mold away and see how cleanly that releases. Once we get to back here, we can kind of bend away the plastic, and that makes it a lot easier to cut off. Here we have the final product. Once everything is demolded, you can take some time to clean up any excess silicone that may still be on the plastic parts, and pay special attention to those edges where you cut off the plastic mold. Make sure they aren't sharp so that nobody gets hurt. Other than that, these are ready to be put on a claw and used in competition. There is one more optional step. You can choose to peel off this entire silicone part and then put it back on with a layer of glue between it and the plastic. As you'll recall, we talked about the silicone not wanting to stick to anything but itself. Right now, these silicone parts are pretty well on here. You can see, just rubbing my thumb on it, it doesn't really want to come off. But after a while of use, these parts may fall off on their own. You can wait to apply the glue until after that happens, or you can do it right away. Either way, that is an option for reattaching these, and that is the reason why the triangular dogs extend from the top all the way to the bottom, so you can take this part and slide it back on and easily reattach it. That's just about going to do it for us today. Congratulations on completing your Loony Claw silicone liners. Have fun running them in competition, and remember to always be graciously professional.